This is another one of the pieces of the puzzle on managing fruit color and relates to the light aspects of fruit red color and how to both design trees and orchards to maximize fruit red color, but also how to improve color using reflective fabrics. I didn't think I really needed to give this part of the talk. I just let Luis talk about our work with fabrics, but Mario convinced me to give a little bit of a background. And as I worked up the talk, I got a little more interested to repeat some basic principles. This is data from early in my career where we looked at different tree shapes and at the amount of light that each part of the canopy receives. The white portion of the canopy is highly color, has a lot of light. The gray portion has between 30 and 50%, and the dark or the black portion has less than 30%. Most of the studies on color show that and on fruit bud development show that it's only the portions of the canopy that receive less than 30% light that really become unproductive. So on the top chart, you see how the central leader tree does over the course of the season, starting right after bloom, 14 days after bloom. We have all the spur leaves out, but not many shoot leaves. There's already a heavily shaded portion in the lower and central portion of that tree. As the season progresses, that black area grows and grows. And in this case, we summer pruned between day 74 and day 110. So you can see that summer pruning between the last two figures did improve the central leader tree, but there's still this big portion that's heavily shaded. Now, a dwarf tree, in the year we did this, we were using slender spindle type trees. If you prune them well, they start with no heavily shaded area. But as the season progresses and shoots grow from the periphery of the tree, a heavily shaded portion develops. But through summer pruning, you can dramatically improve that, leaving only a very small portion of the canopy at the bottom that doesn't get enough light for good fruit color. We compared also V-shaped trees. In this case, it was a Y trellis on M26. And you can see on the left-hand side, early in the season, V-shaped trees have no portion of the canopy that's poorly colored. But as the season progresses, a big area of heavily shaded area on the underside of the canopy develops with poor fruit color. It can be improved somewhat through summer pruning, as you see between the third and the fourth chart. But that's been one of the negatives about V-shaped canopies. Because of that, I think not many people in New York adopted it, but in Washington, they adopted it heavily, but they started adding reflective fabrics to help improve the color on the underside of the trellis. We did a study this year with Luis where we looked at through the day how much light is intercepted with V-shapes versus tall spindle. And you can see that the V-shapes are here on top with and without fabric, but they generally intercept more light at all points of the day than a vertical tree shape like the tall spindle, especially this gray with no reflective film. During the center part of the day, it intercepts only about 30%. Now that's why V-shapes are more productive. They intercept more light and they have higher yield. We've shown that many, many times. But fruit color on the underside of the V's and in the lower portion of the canopy can be poor if not managed perfectly. And so the great solution that's been developed over the last, I don't know how many years, is to use reflective film. Now, a second question that I want to just address briefly is what's the optimum tree height, especially if you're going to stick with the vertical tree format, which most growers in New York tend to want to do. I show on the left this basic relationship showing greater light interception, greater yield, and that's pretty fundamental to apple production. But then I show on the right a theoretical graph showing that how much light you intercept with taller and taller and taller trees with the same between row spacing. So if you're going to plant a pedestrian tree at 7.5 feet tall, you could probably only intercept about 50% of available light. And as you grow that tree taller and taller, 10 feet, 11 feet, 12 feet, 13, you end up getting close to 85% of available light. But even though you're intercepting a high amount of available light, you start to run into trouble where the lower part of the canopy does not receive this minimum 30% of available light that we need. Now, if you use this chart against this yield data over here, you can come up with these sort of theoretical figures that if you grow a pedestrian tree, for whatever reason, you don't want to use ladders, you want to pick from the ground, you're only going to intercept 53% of available light. In this chart, you would have produced 200 tons over 8 years. Just by growing the trees taller, you go up to 85% available light, or 350 tons, or basically 150 extra tons over the 8 years. That's 370 extra bins at $300 a bin. That's $110,000 per hectare extra over 8 years. There's a lot of money involved. And I put up here in blue, there is a penalty for short trees. And I think that although it's a great idea and a great concept, we're going to still have to grow relatively tall trees because our goal is to intercept 75 or 80% of available light. Now, over the years, we have determined that we think the best height to between row spacing ratio is 1 to 1.1 to achieve this 75%. And let me explain. We have two recommendations. One is for more conic shaped trees or three-dimensional trees, either vertical axe or central leader. We have been recommending now for many years for the ratio to be 0.9. For the height of the tree from the ground to the tip should be 0.9 of the between row spacing. So if you're growing on 14-foot rows, 0.9 of that would be about 12.5 feet tall trees. That ensures that the lower portion of the canopy gets enough light for good fruit color. But once we started going to more hedged systems or just pruned manually to two-dimensional shapes, we revised our recommendation to say you could now go to taller trees relative to the between row spacing. And so here I'm showing 11-foot between row spacing. And if you grew 11-foot tall trees, that'd be a 1-to-1 ratio. You can still get very good fruit quality in the lower part of the tree for two reasons. It's very narrow. And secondly, you can still get good penetration of the light into the canopy. In fact, some growers are going to 1.1, but I do want to caution you. Let's assume an 11-foot row spacing. The 1.1 would be about a 12-foot tall tree, a little taller. But if you're going 13 or 14-foot tall tree, you will be paying the price with lower fruit color in the bottom. Now, you can compensate a little bit by putting down reflective film. And so some growers may choose to do that, but just without reflective film, that's the ratio we recommend. So here shows a picture of a beautiful orchard trimmed very narrow in a two-dimensional format. And that's where you get the best fruit color because light only penetrates about 1 meter into the canopy. So canopies that are three-dimensional tend to always have a portion of the fruit that's heavily shaded and it's not produced a proper color. It is important to note that if you put up hail net or shade cloth, it does benefit you in less sunburn with shade cloth and less hail damage with hail nets, but there is a cost in fruit color. Now you can overcome that with reflective films. Now the last point I wanted to make in this short presentation is just the issue of diffuse light that we have in New York. And I show here a diagram showing that in Washington, historically, if you average 10 years, 90% of their light comes as direct light. When direct light hits a leaf, that leaf blocks 90% of that. And so you only can get 10% that penetrates into the canopy more than one leaf layer deep. Now, out of their sunlight, only 10% hits water vapor in the sky and is scattered. That scattered light hitting clouds, we call diffuse light. Now, diffuse light is scattered many times in the sky, but when it eventually hits a leaf, in Washington, there's only 10% of the total energy that comes as diffuse. And when that hits a leaf, the leaf then filters out and only 1% gets through. But since diffuse light comes from all areas of the sky, there's light that can come at a different angle and hit the second layer of leaves and the third layer of leaves. But their situation with mostly cloudless skies means that they have to be very careful not to have thick outer layer of the canopy because it will block essentially all the light to the interior of the canopy. In New York, historically at Geneva, we have this ratio, 60 to 40. Only 60% of our light comes as direct because of a lot of cloudy days, and 40% gets scattered in by the clouds, and we get 40% that's diffuse. And that diffuse light can come in at other angles. Now, Alan Laxo, maybe 40 years ago, showed that in New York, in some cases, we can have better amount energy level of light in the center of our trees than Washington does, even though they have a ton more light, because the outer layer of their canopies essentially blocks 90% of it. And here we have all this diffuse light coming from other angles of the sky that can filter into interior parts of the canopy. So now I want to just switch. I forgot to change the title at the top. These are just New York with both 40 and 60, 60% direct, 40% diffuse. One of the questions I've had over the years is, what do we want in New York? Do we want a luminized reflective film that is basically like a mirror, or do we want fabrics that is a little bit wavy and has different surface level to it? And I've argued without data for years that the luminized will essentially reflect straight back up most of the light. And so it might be really critical where you place that, whether it's in the row middles or whether it's in the between row middles, or underneath a tree or between the rows. Whereas woven fabric, because the reflected light, the diffuse light and direct light hits at different angles, it's reflected in a lot of different directions. And so we've questioned whether there's one is better than the other. And so we did some work this year where we tried to compare that, and that's what Luis is going to talk to you about. So with that, I'll stop sharing and turn it over to you, Luis. And when you're done, we can both answer questions.
Thank you, Terence.